let's get this show on the road. Welcome everybody to another speedrun game. I was away for a week, so once again, my apologies for the delay in the next video, but now the video should be coming out pretty regularly, and I'll be diversifying my content this coming month as well. So we're playing white against very strong player, 2198. This is the strongest opponent that we faced to date. And let's see how the Alapin fares against a serious player of a high caliber. I think there's an idea that the Alapin is sort of only good at beginner to intermediate level, and I vehemently disagree with that. I think it's a tremendously dangerous weapon all the way to GM level. And E6 is one of the many sort of, I wouldn't even call it a second-rate move, but it's definitely one tier behind the two main moves, which are D5 and Knight F6. And E6 is kind of a flexible move in which black can play several different ways. The traditional response here is D5. And for black to be okay with this, for black to play this, he has to be okay with allowing E5, which transposes into an advanced French. But since my recommendation against the French is not to play the advanced, and I've never really played it myself, most of the time Sicilian players with black, even if they don't play the French, are kind of bluffing white into playing E5. And oftentimes neither side really knows what to do in that situation. But the more Alapin-esque way of playing this line is actually to take on D5, after which black is at sort of an early crossroads. You can transpose back into the 2D5 variation if you take with a queen, or you can kind of keep the spirit of the E6 line by taking back with the pawn, and you can already see the kind of workings of an IQP structure, because if black takes back with a pawn, and then at some point white plays pawn takes C5, black recaptures, and then black will have an isolated pawn on D5, and that is the classic isolated queen-pawn structure. And that is exactly what is going to happen. Now, one good thing about the placement of the pawn on C3 is that in this situation where we take on C5 and black takes back, that C3 pawn will have the effect of slowing down the D5 pawn and controlling the square in front of it, which I've talked about very frequently as one of the most important things to do when you're fighting against the isolated queen pawn. You can put a knight on the square in front of it, but more importantly is to control the square. It's more important to control a square than to put a piece on that square. Those are two different things. But pawn takes C5 immediately is decent, but it's not the best way to squeeze the most out of this position. What we would want to do in an ideal scenario, and this concept also exists in openings like the Queen's Gambit, which is that you want to wait for black to move the dark squared bishop first. Then and only then do you take on C5, because that essentially makes black lose the tempo. If black plays bishop E7, and then that bishop again takes the pawn on C5, we've garnered a tempo that we can use to develop our pieces. And so, as far as I remember, the best move and the most commonly recommended move for white is bishop B5 check, just developing our bishop with tempo and asking black another difficult question. Black is again at a crossroads here. Bishop D7 is a move, but generally trades are good for the side that fights the IQP, because the fewer pieces you have, the harder it is to essentially keep that pawn under control. Knight C6 is the more topical response. And now we kind of follow the rule. We don't take on C5. Instead, we develop our pieces and wait for a more opportune moment to take that pawn. The moment black develops his bishop, that would be a very good time to consider taking on C5. Okay. Well, so far we're playing pretty standard moves. This is still well-known theory. And black has multiple ways that they can develop their pieces. There we go. There's bishop D6. Now, what's funny is that we can delay the move d takes C5 one more move. Like, we can castle here. And it's not like black has any good way of resolving the tension in the center. Like, black can't punish us for avoiding d takes C5 for one more move. But I want to kind of stick to a more traditional way of playing. And traditionally, you want to take on C5 the moment the black develops their bishop. Okay, so bishop takes C5 is going to follow, and we've earned a tempo because black has made an extra move with his bishop. So now we can castle, get our king out of the center. And the next big question is going to be, where is our opponent going to develop his knight? There's knight e7 and there's knight f6. And they lead, broadly speaking, to similar positions, but our development is going to be based on where black positions his knight, because in response to knight f6, I like the look of playing bishop g5 and kind of pinning that knight and making it hard for black to move the way that he wants to. But if black develops the knight to e7, then bishop g5 makes a little bit less sense, because that would walk right into the move f6. And f6 in this particular position isn't such a weakening move. It's not something that we would want to pay with several tempi for. Like, we wouldn't want to go bishop g5 and then induce f6 and go back. So black chooses the traditional developing move, knight f6. And here, there are several important ideas that you should be aware of when you're fighting the IQP. In particular, we should have a general sense of where we're putting the rest of our minor pieces. The move I don't like as well, actually, it's interesting, but this check on e1, I think a lot of people would be very tempted to give, but then black can simply cover with the bishop, and the f2 pawn is a major problem in these positions, because the queen can easily come out to b6. There are even some tactics where black takes on f2 and then forks the king and bishop. So we actually would want to keep our rook on f1 in order to solidify the f2 pawn and make sure that there are no tactical shenanigans connected with queen b6 or knight e4, or even bishop takes f2 check. So there's two main questions here. The first is where to position this bishop. We've kind of been deciding on g5. The second is what to do with our knight. And typically, if you're at all familiar with IQP structures, you know that the knight in these situations often travels to b3, hits the bishop, and positions itself on a square where it can blockade the square in front of the pawn. There really aren't any other options for the development of our knight. The real decision we have to make is, what order do we develop our pieces in? But I like the look of starting with bishop g5 because it restricts the knight. It immediately sets up a pin. And of course, the drawback of playing knight b to d2 first is that the bishop would be temporarily blocked in by the knight. So this just seems like a more harmonious way of developing. Bishop e6 instantly follows. I don't love the look of this move. Black is delaying castling and giving us some additional options here, like we could throw in the immediate knight d4 and put some pressure on black's minor pieces, but I really don't want to make too many of these adventurous moves. I want to play in a more traditional fashion to really highlight the techniques that we have of fighting against the IQP. White is slightly better here. Not because black has an IQP. Like, if you watched my speedrun videos, you know that the isolated queen pawn structure is one in which you can't make any categorical assertions about who is better. It all depends on the placement of the other pieces. There are situations where the IQP is a great asset, and there are situations where it's a tremendous weakness. And I think that this situation resembles the latter more than it does the former, just because black's piece activity is not all that impressive. Like, black is pinned along this diagonal. The bishop on e6 is kind of a passive observer and is just sort of tied down to the pawn. And most importantly, as we play knight b3, we've been able to reach and achieve complete control of the square in front of the pawn, which means that the IQP is no longer a moving target, and it's going to saddle black for really likely for the rest of the game, at least for the rest of the time that it exists on d5. So now we enter a stage where we need to make sort of marginal improving moves. We need to build up our advantage, and eventually something is going to give in sort of the ideal scenario. But we have to be careful about like what exactly we do. And if you're not familiar with this structure, then it can be hard to generate helpful moves. You might look at this and say, well, I developed all my pieces. What do I do now? And there are some moves that you really want to avoid. Like, for example, I think some people might want to go queen to d2 here and connect the rooks. But queen d2 tactically runs into the response knight to e4. And that leads to some undesirable trades for white. It leads to undesirable tactics in general. I think the kind of low-hanging fruit that we should start with is actually to position a knight on d4. And as I mentioned earlier, it's more important to control the square in front of the pawn than it is to actually put a piece on that square. But I'm not trying to suggest that putting a piece on it is somehow a bad idea. I really like the look of knight d4 because that knight is sort of on an ideal square. It's putting some pressure on black's minor pieces, and it's just a relatively inoffensive move that we could play without thinking too much about the consequences. So we can go knight fd4, we can go knight bd4. A lot of these minor points are less important than I think a lot of people make them out to be. I think it's more natural to play knight b to d4 just to keep this other knight on the king side, where it controls, some key squares and lends a little bit, another layer of support to white's king. Okay, so knight b to d4. And already we're asking black some more straightforward questions. We're threatening to win a pawn. Like, obviously, we're threatening to take twice on c6. If black plays knight takes d4, which is quite likely, then we recapture with our knight. And already black is in a little bit of trouble there. Like, it's hard to make a move if you're playing black, because the last thing you want to do is move your queen out of d8. Then we would play bishop takes f6 and completely spoil the pawn structure. Bishop d7 is a good move. That's a good move. That's a 2100 move, just sort of keeping the tension and protecting this knight. So what do we do now? Well, black is threatening to play knight takes d4, which again leads to unpleasant tactical complications. We run the risk of losing a piece in that position, because of course if you play bishop takes d7 there, then black will capture on f3 and then recapture on d7 with an extra piece. So we want to avoid those types of complications when possible. We should also keep in mind that you can sometimes successfully change the pawn structure or change the nature of your advantage from an IQP to something more dynamic. And I think this is a very instructive situation in which we can do just that. My instinct is actually to make a move that I would venture to say is unnatural to the vast majority of people. And this is a move that's probably on your radar, but you might think that it's bad because it fixes the problem of black's IQP, and it seems to give away our biggest asset. But the benefit of this move, I think, is that it transforms our advantage from a strictly positional one to an actual initiative, to a situation where our superior piece activity is what gives us the biggest, is what gives us our advantage, rather than the presence of a long-term weakness. And that is the move bishop takes c6. So what are the minuses of this move? Well, there are two big ones. We're giving away the bishop pair, that's number one. But more importantly, we're allowing b takes c6, after which the d5 pawn is no longer isolated. And b takes c6 leads to the hanging pawn structure, which perhaps some of you have heard of. And the hanging pawn structure is characterized by the presence of pawns on the c and d file that are themselves removed from any other pawn. So there's no b pawn and there's no e pawn, so you kind of have this self-sufficient pawn island on c6 and d5, and those are called hanging pawns. And the way that you should kind of think about hanging pawns is that the isolated pawn has shifted from the d file to the c file. The pawn on c6 is now essentially an isolated pawn, even though it has a neighboring pawn on d5. The pawn on d5 can't go backwards and defend c6. So for all intents and purposes, the biggest weakness in the hanging pawn structure is in this position c6. And we can attack that pawn very straightforwardly by positioning our knight on e5. But knight e5 also contains a couple of other important positional threats. First of all, we're threatening to take the pawn on c6. But most importantly, we're also threatening to take on d7 and then to take on f6 and completely ruin black's kingside pawn structure. We can also start with bishop takes f6 because the queen can't recapture, it's defending the bishop. So there are many, many threats that we are creating by positioning our knights in the way that we do. And black is struggling here to keep all of the bases covered. Of course, bishop takes d4 is possible, but then we get a huge advantage. We can even recapture with the pawn. And if you just look at the way that our minor pieces are positioned there, black is borderline positionally lost in case he gives away the dark squared bishop. So it's hard to quantify exactly why white is better in this position. You just have to kind of think of it as a very unpleasant position for black to play because there are a lot of things that he has to keep protected. Black's pieces are passive, and our minor pieces are essentially all on optimal squares. So I think black does have a way to beat back white's initiative, but it would require finding a lot of very accurate moves. So I don't think that bishop c6 is likely to be the engine's recommendation. The engine often likes to drop the bishop back in these types of situations, but, given that we have a big initiative here, and this is more my style, I find this hard to resist. Okay. A lot of tactics here hanging in the air as well. Let's see what our opponent ends up choosing. The fact that he's thinking for this long is a pretty encouraging sign. Black has many ways that they can try to fight this initiative. Yeah, queen e8 is actually a pretty smart move. It's being proposed in the chat because this unpins the queen and attacks the knight on e5, and we'll talk about it after the game. Black plays the move that I was expecting, which is c5, and this is a very straightforward move, but this move fails tactically, if I've calculated this correctly, to a beautiful sequence, and I saw this when I played bishop takes c6. This was one of the things that we kind of had to calculate when making that move. So when you look at this position, your instinct is probably to move the knight away from d4. But that's not the only thing available to us. If you listen carefully to what I just said, you should know that a possibility here is to play bishop takes f6. And queen takes f6 is still impossible. Knight takes d7 also comes with a fork. So after bishop takes f6, g takes f6, at a minimum, we could just take the bishop on d7 and then move this knight away, and we could claim that we're slightly better because black's pawn structure on the king side is damaged. But that also doesn't tell the whole story. If we waltz into that position, black could tuck the king away on h8 and actually use the g-file to his advantage and generate attacking chances against our own king. But I actually think that there's a specific tactical sequence here that leads to very unpleasant consequence for black, although I actually need a little more time here. It's a small detail there that I missed. Wow. Yeah, there's a crazy line. My idea was like bishop takes f6, gf, knight c6, bishop takes c6, knight takes c6, and then we have this tactic where we take on d5 and sack the queen temporarily and then give a fork on e7. I'll have to show all of this after the game. It's just impossible to explain it verbally. So there is one small problem with that idea, and it's actually more than a small problem. It might mean we have to deviate from the path that I had intended. Okay, so I actually think there is an issue with my initial idea. So in that case, I think we have to resort to the more straightforward path here, which is to take on f6, take on d7, and then try to claim a small advantage based on black's weak hanging pawns and the weak king side. Unfortunately, I think we have to go for it. Bishop takes f6, and we have to play a little bit faster here, given our time situation. Okay, let's see what our opponent does here. I mean, queen f6 loses on the spot. I'm not sure what black is thinking about. Yeah, gf. So unfortunately, the move knight c6 here actually fails tactically to bishop c6, knight c6, and then this move queen e8, which is like ultra advanced tactics, and I'll show this in greater depth after the game. But this is the kind of thing you just kind of either you see it or you don't. And as I mentioned before, a lot of top-level chess really boils down to these tactical details that you have to spot. And it's not, they just exist. It's not like you can arrive at them with logical reasoning. You just have to spot them. And now we have to move our knight, but we have to figure out where that knight belongs. Knight f3 I don't like because then the knight will be restricted by the f6 pawn. I actually like the look of knight to c2 or even knight to e2, but we're going to settle on knight to c2 because it keeps the diagonal open for the queen. And the reason I like knight c2 the most is because the knight can reroute to e3 and continue harassing the d5 pawn, which is one of black's main weaknesses here, as is the f6 pawn. So I still think that white is better. It's not as big of an advantage as I had hoped for, but really only one side is having fun. Now, what are some moves that we could make to improve our position? Well, an easy move is queen f3, which continues to target the d5 pawn, but also sets our sights on the f6 pawn. And that's a particularly good response to a move like king h8, because we don't want to leave our king unattended, especially given the fact that at some later point, black can play c4 and open up the bishop's diagonal. So queen f3 is a multi-purpose move. It attacks f6 and it defends g2, and it essentially nips any g-file pressure in the bud. Now, the move I think a lot of people would play here with black is d4. I think people across really all rating ranges would be tempted by this move. But remember that in the middle game, a passed pawn is a double-sided thing. Like on the one hand, that pawn looks dangerous. On the other hand, it's still going to be isolated after the trade on d4. And we have enough pieces to where we can successfully restrain that pawn and then start attacking it. So for instance, one easy way to fight the move d4 would be to take on d4, and then to still play the move queen to f3. Attack the f6 pawn and gain a tempo that we could use to bring our rook into the game, and at that point, the d4 pawn will be in dire straits. I think black will have a very hard time to defend it. Okay, so again, a situation in which it's kind of hard for black to find a helpful move. Maybe rook a to d8 should be considered something slow. But queen f5 would be a good example of like an impulsive move that turns out to be a blunder because it walks right into the fork, right? Knight e3 hits the queen and hits the pawn. And of course, we could grab that pawn and support the knight with c4 if necessary. Oh, I like positions where both sides have only one minor piece. I think they're quite instructive. And these positions are good for like illustrating kind of important strategic and positional ideas. I wouldn't necessarily call this a case of like good knight against bad bishop because black's bishop isn't terrible. Black's bishop could be activated with c4, but the bigger problem in black's position is just all of the pawn weaknesses and the fact that the king is so flimsy. Okay, so rook d8 played. Black puts the other rook on d8, which surprises me a little bit. Now the king feels a little bit even more uncomfortable, and I would start with queen f3 here. We could also start with knight to e3, but this move makes, I think, less sense now that it doesn't attack the d5 pawn. So I think queen f3 is a more accurate way to start because at the very least, it forces black to contend with the big threat of queen takes f6, which makes the king even weaker. Okay, so one idea that our opponent might have is just to throw caution to the wind and play d4 here anyway. And in the event that that happens, after c takes d4, c takes d4, I would be seriously considering the prospect of not taking on f6 because that leads to tremendous complications. It allows black's d-pawn to run amok with d3. I still think that position is good for white. I still think that pawn is not as dangerous as it may appear given all of our pieces and how active they are. But after d4, we could also consider the simple rook a to d1, either before or after c takes d4. So I think d4 is really not a big concern. Okay, queen d6. Ooh, now that is a natural move because it protects f6. But the moment I see this move, I immediately think, well, now the knight can reach f5 with tempo. So knight e3 becomes even more tempting than it was. And if we're concerned about d4, we could definitely start with the move rook a to d1. I think both moves are good. I think rook a d1 is the more measured Russian schoolboy approach. Okay, let's bring all pieces into the game. And later down the line, that rook could actually lift itself over to the king side via d3. So rook a d1 isn't just a defensive move, it's also an attacking. But knight e3 is super juicy because knight f5 is a huge threat. It's a massive threat. And it's a massive threat because it can be accompanied by queen g4, queen g7. So that literally could lead to checkmate really, really quickly. My guess is that in response to knight e3, black is going to go king h8. But I don't see any reason why throwing this pair of moves in is going to be bad for us. Like, I don't see a universe in which that's the case. So we'll start with knight e3, bishop c7. Okay, so that's a one-move threat. That's not scary. I think the simplest way to defend against it is g3. A couple of things to avoid here. We don't want to give an empty check on g4 because that would only help black. And the reason that would help black is because black wants to play king h8 anyway, right? King h8 is a move that favors black because it puts the king on a safer square. So here we want to keep the tension with g3. And definitely we don't want to trade queens. Like maybe I could find a Russian GM who would want to go queen g3 check. But to me, the presence of queens squarely favors white because obviously because of the disparity in king safety and the fact that our queen is tremendously active here. So g3 is kind of a no-brainer. I'm expecting king h8, and in response to that, we're going to play rook a d1 and apply even more pressure on d5. At that point, black will have to play d4, and at that point, I think we could go for material gains. There's just no way that black will be able to keep all his bases covered. Okay, queen e6. Yeah, that move is, I guess, an alternate way to defend, or at least to take the sting out of knight f5. And here I think we should operate by the same principle of not rushing into a move that gives us, that makes us feel good like knight f5, but rather bringing all the toys to the party, because when we actually do go for the kill, all of our pieces will be involved, and it's much likelier that our attack is actually going to succeed. And in the spirit of that, we can do two things. We can play rook f to e1, or we can play the more straightforward rook a to d1. The cool thing about rook f to e1 is that it creates a beautiful tactical threat. And as you guys probably know by now, I find these things very hard to resist. So, rook f to... So rook f e1, I think black might be able to go bishop e5. And that is not necessarily a move that we want to allow, because if we allow bishop e5, then after d4, it's going to be hard for us to target that pawn. So as much as I would like to show off tactically, I feel like it's a better idea to just play the mundane rook a to d1. Not that there aren't tactics here. Like, if black plays d4, if you're watching on YouTube, like, you should pause the video and figure out what we think our response is going to be to d4. And the moment d4 is played, the first thing you should notice is that the queen now makes contact with the rook on a8. And those types of small tactical observations are incredibly important, and people who don't make those observations often miss important tactical opportunities that otherwise are quite easy to see. This is another thing, right? Queen e4. Well, what's the drawback of this move? Once you ask yourself that question, you immediately see that f6 is unprotected. We can't trade on e4, and if we were in more severe time pressure, trading on e4 and getting a big advantage in the endgame would not be a half bad idea. But I really don't see a single reason why we can't just take on f6, especially because the queen on e4 might seem like it's a big strength, but it's actually incredibly vulnerable. Like, the moment we play rook f to e1, we're already going to be threatening massive discovered attacks against the queen. Black's position is essentially just collapsing on all sides. We're already up a pawn. The pawn on d5 is likely to fall as well. The knight is threatening to jump into f5 with unstoppable mate threats. Something's going to give here. And we should remember not to just look for mates. We should remember also to look for quiet moves that just win a bunch of material. And those kinds of moves can be pretty easy to miss. Rook d6. Okay. So tactics, are there any tactics here? I don't see anything overly appealing off the top of my head. Some of you might be tempted by knight takes d5, but unfortunately the rook can just take the knight, right? Rook takes f6 is not forced. I think the simpler approach is just to drop the queen back to g5 and create a fork against the king and the d5 pawn and just snag another pawn. And at that point, we'll be up 2 pawns and we can start trading off pieces and converting our advantage in the endgame. Black simply resigns. This is a resignable position at this level because rook takes d5 is coming. That's 2 pawns down, and the rest of black's pawns are also collapsing. So in an OTB game, I would actually probably resign here against the g out. So it's a short game, but I think it's a really nice game, and it's a good illustration of how quickly things can go wrong when one side mishandles like an IQP structure. And it also shows you, I think, that you don't need to be like super erudite in these structures to play them well. You just need to exercise common sense. You need to know a couple of key positional ideas. And at that point, you can already successfully fight against the IQP. So there's, a misconception that with certain pawn structures, you have to be Magnus Carlsen in order to play them well. Well, I never really learned how to fight against IQP structures formally, and yet I think I'm pretty good against them just by using my common sense and by acting based on all of my experience in these structures. Okay, so let's open up another instance of the game. We've now reached 2100, and we'll start with a quick theoretical overview of this line, which I don't think we faced before, so it's a good idea to put out some background. So again, here, black can play queen takes d5, but this transposes into a completely different line. This is very little to do with the type of position that we got in the game, and this is more commonly reached after d5 takes, d4, e6, and knight f3. And here, typically, black plays knight f6. And the move that I recommend here is knight to a3. And this we have had, I think, already in the speedrun. And the idea of knight a3 is to meet c takes d4 with this classic idea, knight b5, which you will find across many different Alapin lines. So we've had these types of lines many times. What we haven't faced is the kind of pure e6 variation with e takes d5. Okay, so bishop e5 check, if I'm not mistaken, is the recommendation of Kalifman in the Alapin Bible that I've been using to give you some theoretical context on the lines that we've had. I'm going to double check that this is in fact their recommendation, but I'm 99% sure that it is. Just give me a moment. So e4, c5, c3, e6, d4, d5, takes. I'm going to pull out e6, d4, 128. Yes, they also analyze some other sidelines that we will leave out of this analysis. Actually, no, I confused the line slightly. Basically, their recommendation is knight f3, and only in response to knight f6 are they recommending bishop to b5 check. So I made this move slightly premature. I think bishop b5 is probably a good move as well. So let me check this with... yeah, bishop b5 check is also very common, the immediate bishop b5 check. But I think it might be more accurate to start with knight f3. And if black plays knight f6, we play bishop b5 check, and we get a very, very similar type of position where typically black plays bishop d7, we play bishop takes d7 check, and we get a very similar type of IQP position. And long story short, if you play... Whoops. Just a moment. Thank you, Jimster, for the tier 1. What's up, Ihusni? Good to see you. It's been a while. Yeah, so if you start with knight f3, I'm trying to figure out like what the benefit is of starting with knight f3 over starting with this check. And what I'm understanding is that, no, actually, it often transposes. Like, for instance, if after ed, knight f3, black plays knight c6, which is the main line, their recommendation is still to play bishop b5. So by and large, I think these two moves should transpose into each other. So let's stick to like the move that I played in the game. I actually think that knight c6 is best. I think that bishop d7 already gives white a nice little edge. So here, after bishop takes d7, knight d7, knight f3, knight f6, we castle, black plays bishop e7. And these types of positions are pretty much thankless for black because black has this isolated queen pawn and not much to show for it. Because with the light squared bishops gone, black's activity is at a minimum. And I think the simplest way to play here is something like, I don't know, even knight to a3, castles knight to c2 is a popular way of getting the knight onto a square where it can jump into d4. And I would take this position with white any day. But if you turn on the engine, it often gives a very misleading evaluation of like either total zeros or a minuscule edge for white. But I think from what you saw in our game, these types of positions are very, very hard for black to play because black has no clear plan and no clear way to improve their position. Whereas white, I think, has many ways to improve. Like the bishop can come out, the knight can occupy d4, we can make some luft. Later on, the knight can jump into f5. And I like the look of this a lot for white. The engine also recommends, instead of knight a3, it also recommends the more simple bishop e3. And it does give white an ever so slight edge, which I think is totally justified. So, for example, bishop e3 castles, white plays knight b to d2. Of course, this position has still occurred like dozens of times. Actually, Jospin played this against David Howell recently. Jospin played rook e8 here. David played the top engine move, which is queen to c2, just coordinating the rooks and getting the queen on a better square. Jospin played queen c7. David played rook a to d1. Look at how natural white's moves are. And, okay, there's some other Grandmaster game where black played bishop d6. And here the simple bishop d4 would have led to a sizable advantage for white, because the knight on f6 is targeted. And if the knight jumps into e4, white can just sidestep the tension with knight to b3. And it's important to understand that black is always going to struggle with the long-term weakness on d5. You should also remember that on d4, you can put either a bishop or a knight, and both pieces are often very, very effective blockaders. Like traditionally, it's recommended to put a knight on the square in front of the IQP, but often putting a bishop on that square is quite good as well. So this line isn't like all that theoretical, especially if black plays bishop d7. Like this line is pretty quiet, so it's not essential that you remember like the exact move order. It's more important that you kind of remember the general setup and where the pieces belong. So knight c6 is a lot more theoretical because here black keeps the light squared bishops on the board, and the position is quite a bit sharper and more concrete. Okay, so knight to c6, knight to f3, black plays bishop to d6, which is the main move. Still thousands of games in the database. dc, bishop c5, so we're following the main line. Castles. And here, so here is a critical moment. Knight f6, I think, is an inaccuracy, and it's a very rare move. And as I indicated during the game, I think black's best bet to fight for equality is actually knight to e7. I still think that white is slightly better here, but I think this placement is much better than on f6, because this pin is incredibly nasty, and as you saw in the game, black was never really able to fix the problem of this pin against the knight. So the main move is knight ge7. Here, white typically responds with knight b to d2, black castles. And white, of course, plays knight to b3. Black's main move is bishop b6, but the newer engines actually prefer to put the bishop on d6 so that it can exert some degree of pressure on the h2 pawn. And here the best move is to drop the bishop back to d3, which does a couple of things. This bishop is very harmoniously placed. It's pressuring h7 and thereby preventing bishop g4, which falls for this common tactic. This isn't a Greek gift. This is just like a simple way to win a pawn because you're picking up the bishop. And again, you run into a situation where black kind of runs out of helpful moves to make. Most people play h6, and white responds with h3. Now bishop g4 has to be prevented. And if black plays knight to f5, which is the main move, the engine really likes this idea bishop c2 followed by queen to d3, and black can land in big trouble really, really quickly. Like I'm seeing a bunch of Grandmaster games where black loses in a couple of moves. Here's another Jobava game. And Jobava had this with white against Tragubov, rook e8, queen to d3, and white is already in incredibly good shape. Like the engine gives a big advantage to white because g4 is a major threat. The queen is coming into h7, and if you can force black to play g6, well, now black has even more weaknesses. The rook is coming into d1. Now the pawn is very hard to defend. I'm just kind of trying to give you a flavor of, the kinds of moves that you should be making here with white. Because certain things have to be understood, like, strategically. You can try to memorize a bunch of theory in this line, but I think it's a much better idea just to kind of learn what the typical moves are and what you should be aiming for. And there's no better way to do that than just to kind of open-endedly explore some of the main moves and to see what the GMs play, etc., etc. If black drops back to b6 instead of d6, I don't think that significantly changes white's approach. Again, it's always a good idea to start with rook e1. And it's important to understand that bishop g4 in and of itself is not a dangerous move. Like, this pin is not dangerous when black is exerting it because black has no easy way to put more pressure on the knight. So, for instance, a good way to fight this is to start with h3 and now to just continue trading off pieces with bishop e3. And if black takes on e3 and plays knight f5, big deal. You just drop the rook back to e1. And if black tries knight h4, then you can just drop the bishop back to e2. And all of this hinges on one very important concept, which is that if almost all of the minor pieces come off the board and you get a position like this, this is a great illustration of why the IQP is such a huge liability, because when there are no pieces left on the board, black has a very hard time defending this pawn while also taking care of the other priorities in the position, like white controls the e-file and black can't play rook e8 because black loses the pawn. Black also can't play d4 because white picks up the pawn with rook a1, simple tactics. This is just a pin. And if black plays queen d7, then black again runs into like a direct attack on the pawn, rook a1, and then you can play knight c5. And already here, black loses the pawn again because these two threats are unstoppable at the same time. So, yeah, so that is why I think this e6 line is pretty decent from an engine perspective, but from a human perspective is incredibly hard to play. So in the game black plays knight f6, we respond with the natural bishop g5. Bishop e6 might be another inaccuracy, but I don't want to bog down too much in all of the details. We go knight bd2. We play all of the natural IQP moves, put the knight on d4, and black plays bishop to d7. If I were black, I would probably consider fighting this by playing rook to c8. I think this might be a better version of what we got in the game, because here, if white does the same thing as in the game, well, the bishop is still on e6. So here I think c5 is a much better version for black, because this move is no longer effective due to queen takes f6. Remember that there used to be a bishop on d7 in the game. So here black has to be already very, very precise not to end up in serious trouble. And if black just like trades a bunch of times on d4, the situation becomes really, really dire, because now we have the bishop pair. We have essentially an eternal pin against black's knight, and there's just no good way for black to play here. Of course, black can try to continue trading pieces off, but we would be more than happy, I think, to reach an endgame like this. I think you'd agree with me that, this is like an ideal IQP scenario where black is going to suffer for the rest of the game with his miserable pawn structure. So no easy way for black to solve his problems. Our opponent played bishop d7, and now transforming the advantage, right? First, we try to attack the IQP, but we're not hesitant to transform our advantage from like positional to more tactical. Here, our advantage consists of the fact that we have much more active pieces, and black still has a serious pawn weakness on c6, which is being attacked. And already a very, very difficult position for black to play. According to the engine, the only way to keep a decent position was either the move that our opponent played, and we'll delve into that in a second, but there was another intriguing resource in the form of bishop c7. This is almost an unfindable idea. Now, let's see who can figure this out. What is black's response to bishop takes f6? And just by asking this question, I'm already giving you a pretty big hint. So if you're watching on YouTube, you should pause and try to figure this out. How can black tactically try to solve some of his problems? And this is just about forcing yourself to look at a move that your brain might be subconsciously rejecting or consciously rejecting. Yeah, queen takes f6. And the idea is to meet knight d7 with queen d6, forking the pawn and the knight. But the depressing thing about black's position is that even if all of this works out, congratulations, amazing, white plays queen a4, and white is still better, because the pawn on c6 is still a major weakness, and the knight is still better than the bishop. And this is the terrifying thing about playing essentially with permanent weaknesses. Is like, no matter how creative you are, how nicely you solve your problems, you're still going to be saddled with long-term weaknesses, and your opponent is still going to have a very comfortable game. In fact, this pawn cannot really be defended. Like, but the engine is giving some like tactical ways to do it, like rook b8 to attack b2, and then if b4, then rook to b6, which is an awkward move. Now the rook is kind of stuck off sides. And I would immediately try to get the open file with rook a to e1. I mean, who in their right mind would want a position like this with black, right? So bishop c7 might have been the most accurate move. Our opponent played c5. And here we enter the kind of more tactical phase. So initially, after bishop f6 gf, my idea, was to play knight c6. And this is based on an important tactical concept that you should be very well aware of, which is that the knight from c6 often aims at e7. And this is a super common tactic across almost all openings. Like, you can find an equivalent of this trick in a million different types of positions. A simple example, if you've watched my stream, you know that this is very prevalent in the Jobava London, where if black plays, for instance, even knight c6 in this position, already after knight b5, black cannot defend c7. So a lot of people try to give away the pawn in order to intercept the bishop's diagonal, and the most common move here is knight to e4. And that walks right into a similar instance of this type of tactic. Here, the key square is c7 rather than e7, but you get the point. It's the same general principle. Now, if I remember correctly, I even had a game many years ago where I was able to use this idea to win a really nice game. Let me see if I can dig this up. My opponent was not particularly strong, but knowing this idea helped me make my way out of the tactical complications in one piece. I found it. So this is back when I was 1900. This is an old game of mine from 2006. That's kind of a terrifying thought. And, okay, great. So it's white to play in this position. And my opponent has just, I have just played the move queen to e4 in order to target the c4 pawn. And I remember not expecting this move and kind of sensing that this must be tactically wrong, but I couldn't figure out exactly why. And then it occurred to me. So you play queen takes c4. Black plays bishop takes c2. And one of the lectures in the camp that I just did was avoiding autopilot moves. And this is, I think, a great illustration of that. I basically identified 5 common situations in which autopilot tends to take over. And one of them, of course, is when one of your heavy pieces is threatened, either the rook or the queen. Especially newer players, just like instinctually move a piece when it is threatened. And if you go rook c1, then black plays bishop b3, and black is completely fine. But if you just pause for a second, you should immediately spot the correct idea, which is this move knight d5. And now you open up an attack on the bishop and against the queen. And of course, black can't take because he drops the queen. So I was expecting my opponent to play queen to d7 here, and I had cooked up the desperado sack knight takes c7, and queen takes c2, and I'm up a pawn. But to my great surprise, black finds a very creative defensive resource, bishop to b3. And it took me a second to figure out how to make my way out of this, white to play. And obviously you know what the theme is, and so you know that the move is queen takes c6. The only move that gives white a big advantage. And my opponent declines the quote-unquote sacrifice, but the idea is that if the queen sack is accepted, white emerges with 2 extra pawns in a completely winning endgame. And my opponent went away. I took the pawn anyway. I managed to trade queens, and I ended up winning the game. So I didn't calculate it all in advance, but this kind of comes all of a sudden. Still, anytime you're accessing the e7 pawn, remember that these like queen deflection tricks are pretty common across many different types of positions. And as a general takeaway, remember that like tactical vision is based not just on pattern recognition and on like solving a bunch of puzzles, but also on like consciously keeping track of tactical patterns that you come across. And I'm annoyed that this isn't talked about more frequently. Like, it's not all about pattern recognition and training your brain to see stuff. It's also about consciously being aware, like, oh, my knight's on c6. Okay, there's a weak pawn on d5. There's a weak king on g8. Well, what patterns am I aware that exploit all of these things? The problem, though, is after knight takes c6, black has a very advanced idea. Black can drop the queen over to e8. And this seems to give the pawn away without a fight. But suddenly, after rook c8, the knight is trapped. The knight literally has nowhere to go. It's a rare situation where the king is weak, white's pieces are more active, but somehow black is able to pick up the minor piece. Now, let's say that you blundered the knight. Let's say you went for this line, and you're staring at this position. You're like, I'm screwed. What would you do here with white to give yourself the most practical chances? Another good exercise. Let's say you blundered. How do you respond to this blunder? What's the only way to get practical chances for white? So I think most people are probably thinking rook e1. But rook e1 is a really bad move because it actually helps your opponent do what he wants to do anyway. Like, yeah, you got your rook to an open file, but now you just have a piece for a pawn. If you've blundered a piece like this, your first question should be, can I give the piece away for a maximum amount of material? And the best move here, the only move I think that gives white serious chances, is knight takes a7. Because at the very least, you've created a 3-on-1 on the queen side, and then I would just like push a4. I would try to prepare myself for a potential endgame by pushing this pawn up as far as it'll go and trying to keep this bishop out of commission. So just, very important takeaway, like when you blunder a piece like this or when your opponent traps a piece, you shouldn't immediately panic. And you should always begin by asking whether this piece can be given up for a maximum amount of material. Okay? So anyways, this is what I had to avoid. And this is why we took on d7 and dropped our knight back to c2 and kind of keep a relatively small but very stable advantage. So I actually think rook f d8 is a very serious mistake. And this is an advanced mistake, right? This is like a 2100 level mistake. If you're 900 and you're watching this, I think this will be a little harder to understand. But broadly speaking, this move is a mistake because it leaves the king without any defenders, and it makes the move queen f3 incredibly strong. There's another hidden reason, which is that the rook on a8 is now in the crosshairs of white's queen. And there's no way to like see this when you play rook fd8, but in my opinion, it would be much more natural for black to put the other rook on d8, and this would avoid a lot of the problems that black came across in the game. So here we would still play queen f3, and if we follow the line from the game, like queen d6, knight e3, it's still very bad for black, that's true. But probably in this position, black's best and maybe last chance would be to generate counterplay with d4. I really think that black had to try to rely on the only asset in his position, the passed pawn, the potentially passed pawn, and try to shove it down as far as it'll go. Okay, could have said that differently. Here, we would have probably played rook a to d1, and I don't know, queen to d5 is the engine move, so yeah, like black has to defend like an engine basically to get practical chances. The engine, by the way, gives, the chess.com engine gives rook f to e1, which is a slightly weird move because it allows d3. But the point is the one that I made to you during the game, which is that I think when a newer player looks at a position like this, they're automatically super afraid of this pawn. Like, oh, well, this pawn is going to promote, and d2 is really scary. In fact, d2 is a huge mistake because this pawn is a lot more of a weakness than a strength. And I think passed pawns in the middle game is a concept which is not talked about enough because it's a concept associated primarily with the endgame. In the middle game, like passed pawns can often be very, very double-sided. In this case, it's a big weakness because it's only a matter of time before white surrounds this pawn. In fact, after a move like rook f to e8, well, rook f to e8, we have knight g4, and the f6 pawn is indefensible. But a very instructive line is what white does after queen to e6. White has a really sexy way here of winning the pawn on d2. And it's a retreating move that's hard to find. This is like a grandmaster level move. I think a lot of you might be saying, oh, it's queen e2. But if you play queen e2, you walk into c4. And again, this is super advanced, like tactical complications, but the bottom line is that the knight is now pinned. Instead, you should consider knight f1. Of course, you would want to go knight c4, but that square is protected, so instead you play knight f1. Good job. And black has no way to defend e2. And largely it's because this bishop is so out of the game. Black can still play c4, but then we take on d2, and black has little to no compensation for the extra pawn. So, okay, so rook a d8 would have been a better option. When black put the other rook on d8, I still think black should have played t4 here. So I think the decisive mistake is actually queen to d6, because once this knight gets to e3, the combined threats against black's king, coupled with all of the threats against this pawn, cause black's position to just completely fall apart. So I think black's last chance would have been to play d4 here and prevent this knight from easily reaching e3. White has a variety of things that they can do. I probably would have gone rook a to d1. And to be honest, like the engine move here, which is queen d5, didn't even occur to me because we can just take f6, and white is still much better. But at least, black maintains some semblance of counterplay here. Maybe queen e6, but then we go rook f1 and continue chasing the queen around. So this is just a bad position for black. And these positions are almost impossible to play for players like under, 2400. If in that line queen takes a2, so like rook a d1, queen d5, queen f6, queen a2 gets mated. Like we go rook d3, and I mentioned this idea during the game, like the rook lift can come all of a sudden because you're not thinking about it, you're thinking about what's going on in the center, but suddenly rook g3 is completely unstoppable. Maybe black can try this, but then f4 is super powerful, just intercepting the bishop and preparing rook to g3. So the bottom line is that you have to keep an eye on everything at the same time. You can't get fixated on one particular aspect of your advantage, and at all times you have to keep track of why you're better. Like, what are the advantages that you possess? Here, it's primarily divided into, I would say, three things. The first is, and most obvious, is like the weakness of black's pawn structure, but attendant to that is also the great weakness of the king. The second is the pressure that we exert on black's center, primarily the d5 pawn. And then the third aspect of our advantage is the superior knight when compared to the bishop, because the knight is very, very good at accessing a lot of these weak squares. So a good example of transforming the advantage, the pawn is no longer isolated, but it's still incredibly weak. And just to be clear, the reason d4, well, it doesn't lose immediately, but knight f5 is kind of a hammer blow. Because if black plays queen to d5, then he gets forked. If black plays queen to e5, then the win is very straightforward. We can just like give a check and win the queen. And so in this position, black would have had to drop the queen back to f8. And here again, the best engine move is super instructive. What do you think the top engine move is here? It's a very patient move, and it's a move that shows that you understand like the scope of your advantage, and you understand the importance of being very patient. Yeah, rook fe1 is great. Even better is to play rook a to d1, because this move exerts pressure on d4. But what else does it do? Well, what it does is it actually prepares a rook lift. So here, for example, black can't even defend the f6 pawn. But even if black tries to sack the exchange, we ignore it and go rook d3, rook h3 and win the game, because black is totally paralyzed. So when you're in a situation where you sense that the win is close, don't try to win it all in 3 moves. Like, don't try to force anything. Remember that in some positions, you can just make these slower moves. And because your opponent has no easy way to fix the problems in their position, you can afford to play with this kind of tempo. And this is stuff that you kind of gain by feel and by experience. You can learn it, but moves like rook 81 are moves that you make on the basis of like a lot of experience converting these types of positions. So anyways, or rook e1 also would have been very strong. Black plays bishop c7. We defend against mate. We bring our rook into d1 and we win the game. E is the line knight d4 cd cd. And here, actually, another very instructive moment. The majority of people, including myself, would probably play rook takes d4. This is what I mentioned in the game. But if you analyze with the engine, like this position is a lot less convincing than the one after white's best move. The issue is that if you continue gobbling pawns, you've suddenly given black like a fair measure of activity. And this is often what happens when you go pawn grabbing. Like, this is a trade-off. When you take a bunch of pawns, you're spending tempi and you're often opening up the position, which is giving your opponent's pieces a certain degree of activity. Now, sometimes that's a normal part of the winning process. Like, sometimes you have to give your opponent a fair measure of activity. But here, I think it's actually quite hard to keep black's initiative tamped down. If you drop back to a6, suddenly the rook comes into d2. And suddenly, the knight can't move from e3 because of the discovery. So much better than rook takes d4, and much more patient would have been actually knight to f5. Great example of seeing a tactic, but considering the other candidate moves. And when you start looking at knight f5, you realize why it's so much stronger. Well, first of all, you have this queen g4, queen g7 threat, so black's response is forced. Now again, you can take on d4, but even better is to just accumulate the pressure with rook fe1, because this pawn is not going anywhere. You can take this pawn essentially whenever you want. So after black plays bishop b5, now is a great time to play rook takes d4, because you can't take with the bishop. You definitely can't take with a rook, because here you just get checkmated. And white's next move is just going to be rook h4 and queen h5 with checkmate. Now, are you expected to see this particular idea when you play knight f5? No, you're just making natural moves. And in the course of making those natural moves, these kinds of wins arrive at your doorstep. By the way, queen to d5, rook to e8 check, very important trick that you should be aware of. This wins the queen via deflection. You see this a lot in Puzzle Rush. Black has no good squares for the queen. The game is over. If the queen goes to the other side of the board, you can still play rook takes d4. Because again, this gets checkmated. Rook d8 and queen takes d8 is a very pretty pattern. Rook e8 is a back rank mate. So that would have been the most efficient response to d4. Instead, our opponent gives away f6 and then gives away d5 and resigns. I would have played some more moves, but obviously, like after king h8, rook takes d5, at this point, the simplest approach to winning would just be to trade the queens off the board. And you can't really blame black for not wanting to play this position down 2 pawns with like more pawns falling along the way. So the actual end of the game was pretty anticlimactic, but there was a lot that was contained sort of behind the scenes. So a couple of takeaways from this short, simple, but instructive game. First of all, this line against the Alapin is often tempting for people because the engine really likes it. But in my opinion, it's a pretty inferior version of the IQP structure and a very, very difficult position for black to play. Like, you need to know a ton of theory with black. You need to know all the right setups in order to play this successfully. I've tried playing this with black against the Alapin, and I've never enjoyed it. So then, of course, we talked at length about where the pieces kind of belong when you're fighting the isolated queen pawn. The most important rule is to control the square in front of the pawn, to develop your pieces actively, and to understand that you're not fixated on the IQP. There's other stuff in the position that you can also do. And that was the theme of bishop takes c6, which is a classic example of transforming your advantage. So don't be afraid to give away one strength of your position in return for another. That is a normal part of the conversion process. So here black no longer has the IQP. Instead, black has the hanging pawn structure, but in return, we get massive piece activity and tremendous tactical potential. Thank you, the Brontologist. That is the sort of basic premise of this game. Here we narrowly dodged a bullet with knight dc6. Still a good tactical pattern to keep in mind. But we were not afraid just to make a retreating move, knight back to c2, in order to involve it around on e3. And then a classic example of fighting and exploiting multiple things at once, right? Not just the d5 pawn, which is once again now black's major weakness, but also the weak pawn on f6 and the weak king. And by combining pressure against all of these things, we were able to cause black's position to collapse really, really quickly. And that is about it. Any questions? Yeah, IQP stands for isolated queen pawn, which is a very common structure that occurs across many, many different types of openings. The Alapin is just one of them. And the IQP in the Alapin occurs across many different lines. Like, the e6 variation is not the only one in which black gets the IQP. Most commonly, the IQP is reached via the kind of the main line. So like, but here it's white who has the IQP. Like, at any point in the main line, black can play the move c takes d4, and now it's white who has the IQP. And it's actually quite unique for an opening to feature two different lines where, like, both sides essentially experience the isolated queen pawn. And I'm sure that we're going to face this particular line from the white side as well. So I'll have a chance to talk about playing with the IQP as well. Here we talked about playing against it. So IKP is not like a known concept because the isolated king pawn is not common across openings. So of course, like, you could have an isolated king's pawn, but that's not like a commonly talked about structure, if that makes sense. Okay. So one question by RE1, what about blocking with the rook and make the queen move at the end there? I'm not sure what you're referring to. Oh, blocking with the rook here? Well, then we just play queen takes d5. Like, if you're talking about blocking with the rook here, then we just play queen takes d5. We could even play knight takes d5. If you want to be fancy, you can even do this. I would caution against this type of stuff unless you're a professional, but yeah, this is also a possible way of winning a second pawn. Okay, so the Alapin prevails once again. We can see that it holds up at a very high level, and I will continue fighting that misconception until the end of my days. Hope you enjoyed the game. It was a simple one. I'm still kind of recovering my energy after the camp I taught in, so sorry if I was a little bit lethargic, and I'll see you guys later. Thanks everybody for hanging out. I hope you enjoyed the speedrun and the blitz.